this unit by talking about intermolecular forces, or IMFs. So get out your chemistry notebook and write today's date at the top along with IMFs. Intermolecular forces, or IMFs, are attractions between different molecules. So these attractions are called intermolecular forces of attraction. So we have two molecules that are held together through an IMF. So there is a difference between inter and intramolecular forces. Intra is between atoms, and I like to remember this because an atoms, and then inter is between molecules, and molecules has an E in it. So maybe that's helpful, but again, we're going to be talking about attractions between different molecules. Make sure you have this definition written down. So again, we just said an IMF is a force between separate molecules. IMFs help us explain why some substances dissolve in water and others don't. So we talked in the last video about how a polar substance will dissolve in a polar substance and a nonpolar substance will dissolve in a nonpolar substance, but a nonpolar molecule will not mix or dissolve with a polar molecule. So that is why oil and water do not mix, and IMFs help to explain this. So we have different types of IMFs that we will be reviewing or be learning about. So the first one is an ion dipole. So take a minute, what is an ion? An ion is a charged molecule, a charged atom. So for example, chlorine is an anion. It is a charged atom of chlorine. And then these are all dipoles. You have a slightly negative end and two slightly positive ends. So if you were to draw your dipoles, of course your dipoles show it going towards the more electronegative negative ion or negative atom in the molecule. So these are all polar, and these we can call a dipole. So ion dipole, here's another ion. It's a charged ion of sulfur. And then we have these dipoles here, because if we were to draw arrows representing the dipoles, we would have an overall dipole in this polar molecule. So these are an example of an ion dipole intermolecular force. We also have dipole-dipole. So think for a second, what might that be? Probably you got it right. It is an intermolecular force between different dipoles, and we can show them by drawing little dotted lines between the two, which we'll see in a future one. Then hydrogen bonding is what we'll talk about the most, and you'll actually talk about this a lot in biology next year, which is why we're going to focus on that this year as well. So hydrogen bonding is a type of a dipole intermolecular force, and it is special because it is about 10 times stronger than a normal dipole-dipole interaction. This is an intermolecular force between a hydrogen in one molecule and an oxygen in another molecule, or between hydrogen and fluorine in two different molecules, or hydrogen and nitrogen between two different molecules. This is because atoms are small and electronegative. A very polar bond leads to an even stronger intermolecular force. So a bunch of water molecules show hydrogen bonding perfectly. This, like I said, the dotted lines here represent an IMF, so we see the bonding or the attraction between different molecules, so the IMFs are present right there. The slightly positive end of one molecule is being attracted to the slightly negative end of another molecule, and specifically since it's between hydrogen and oxygen, it is hydrogen bonding. Then we also have dipole-induced dipole, and dipole-induced dipole, write down that this is between a dipole, so a polar molecule, and a nonpolar molecule. So here is just, or an atom, so this is, for a split second, it's going to have a dipole. But we will not talk too much about that this year. So we talked a little bit during the water activity where you had the Google Slides about why hydrogen bonding helps explain why ice is less dense than water. And we won't get into this too much, but it all has to do with the different structures that are holding it together. Then the last type of intermolecular force we're going to talk about is called a London dispersion force, or an induced dipole. And this exists between all molecules regardless of their polarity. So each molecule can have, between different molecules, you can have different types or several explanations of what IMF is present, and this one exists between all molecules regardless of the polarity. This is named London Dispersion Forces because it was proposed by a scientist named Fritz London in 1930. And this must exist because even when we have nonpolar molecules such as oil, they're held together through something, and so we have to have some sort of IMF, and we can call these the London Dispersion Forces. And this happens very quickly. That you have an induced dipole, or for an instant you have a dipole that helps bond things together. So if we had Cl2 molecules, they are going to have an intermolecular force between other Cl2 molecules. So we see the intermolecular forces between the two atoms being held together, but then we have an intermolecular force holding the multiple chlorine molecules together. And the IMF, again, is called a London dispersion force. And again, this is just saying that every atom attracts every other atom with this force, a positive and a negative attraction, again, but the polarity is only very temporary. So the slightly positive and slightly negative ends are attracted, but this is just a temporary idea. We're not going to talk too much about how they form, but if you're interested, you can pause the video and look at this. So here, what kind of intermolecular forces are present? Pause the video, write it down in your notes. So here we might see hydrogen bonding between the H and the O's. We for sure also see a dipole, this is a dipole and an ion. So between the ion and the dipole, we can draw a dotted line to show that as well. And then of course, London dispersion forces are always present. So we have those three that are found here in this example. In a very general sense, strong intermolecular forces, so such as hydrogen bonding or stronger IMFs that we see, are solid until really high temperatures, and then weak IMFs a lot of times are gas. So that's why we talk about like chlorine being gas, and we saw that example of London dispersion forces that are very weak being gaseous. And then boiling points and melting points are very good indicators of about how strong something is. So of course, again, like we said, strong IMFs, solid until high temperatures, so that can help us see, okay, if this molecule is solid until high temperatures, it's probably going to be pretty strong intermolecular forces. So here is a little bit of a chart that will be very helpful. So you should write this down in your notes so that you can refer back to it throughout this unit, especially with the types of interactions and the factors that are responsible for these interactions, and then answer those three questions in your notes as well. Your teacher will be looking for those answers. So pause the video, copy that down, answer those questions. And then take a minute and answer these 4 summary questions. These are some practice questions on your own. Refer back to previous parts of the video or your notes to help you out. Make sure that you take a clear picture of your notes and these practice questions and submit them to Google Classroom, and we'll talk a lot more about this next class.